you for the introduction, and also thank you to the committee for inviting me. It's a really great opportunity as a fourth year PhD student to introduce myself to more of the paleo community, and also to showcase a little bit of what I've been up to during my PhD. And I'll spend the next 20 minutes or so discussing some work that I did in the first year of my PhD. And this is a data compilation study that we started during one of the lockdowns. So it definitely would not have happened without these names on the slide. So thank you to those of those people who sent data, both unpublished and published data, but also samples that once we did get access into the labs, we finally could run and get some data from. So yeah, just to kind of break down the structure of the talk, I'll begin by introducing some key background information, and I'll do this by breaking my title into two sections. Firstly, what do I mean by petrogenic organic carbon? And then also what is the PETM, although as this is a paleo group, I'll probably keep that section brief. And then I'll highlight what our key question was going into this study, how we went about it, and the actual exciting bit. Then I'll move on to what we uncovered. So starting very broadly, when we think about the global carbon cycle, we think of carbon stored in various reservoirs on Earth, carbon that's stored in the atmosphere, in the oceans, within plants and in the soil, but also carbon that's trapped in the rocks. And we importantly consider how carbon is moving between these different reservoirs, and specifically on the longer term process, how carbon is moving between the lithosphere and the atmosphere, because this is going to have the big large scale impact on the CO2 in our atmosphere, which of course will then impact our global climate. But I think when most people imagine what they think of when they think of the long-term carbon cycle, I think this is the kind of textbook image that pops to mind. It's the CO2 that's being released through volcanic activity versus this CO2 that's been sequestered and drawn down via silicate weathering or carbonate burial. And these processes are mostly focusing on inorganic carbon. And so we're missing a big chunk of what's going on here by not looking also at organic carbon and the role that this might have. Although in the last 20 or so years, this has become something that's more of an emerging interest. And when I talk about the organic carbon cycle, I talk about it in two different pools on land. So firstly, we have organic carbon that's been freshly made by plants and living organisms, and that's been recently buried, so within the last 100 or so years in the soil. And I'll refer to this as OC bio. But we also have carbon that's much older, that's been buried under high temperature and pressure. And this old fossilized carbon I'll refer to as OC petro. And this distinction between the two sources are really important to make, because depending on which of these stores of carbon end up getting eroded and transferred from land to the ocean, and also whether it's immediately buried or it's more slowly transferred, thereby more prone to be oxidized and adding CO2 into the atmosphere. So depending on all of these factors, you can have very different outcomes. And I've simplified it into four main outcomes here, but rather than going through each one in detail, I just want to draw your attention onto these last two. So both of these are involving OC petro. And as you can see, regardless of if it's immediately buried or if it's mostly oxidized, OC petro, if it's mobilized and transferred to the ocean, it's going to become a CO2 source. And so the big question is, what is OC petro going to do in our future, especially in a warmer and wetter future? Because an increase in precipitation has been strongly linked with more erosion and more transfer of material from land to the sea. And so it could become a really important positive feedback mechanism in the future. And it could become this important source of CO2. So yeah, it would be really crucial to know what kind of role this might play. And of course, that's where looking into the past comes in, and we can specifically look at the PETM. And again, I'll keep this brief, but the PETM was this event about 56 million years ago. So here you've got deep ocean temperatures on the y-axis. And as you can see where the red arrow is pointing is this really distinct and very transient peak that occurs about 56 million years ago. And this is the PETM. And we know that this was caused by a huge input of 13C depleted carbon, or isotopically light carbon, and that occurred around within 1 to 10,000 years. And the general consensus is that this is probably mostly from a lot of volcanic activity that was going on in the North Atlantic, amongst other sources as well. But what we know less of is what then continued the PETM to go on for another 100,000 or so years. And why was the PETM so long? And what was the source of carbon during this time? And also, what then resulted in the recovery of the PETM and the end of the PETM? What was drawing down that carbon at that time? But interestingly, about 4 years ago in 2019, this paper came out, and they found that there was an order of magnitude increase in OC petro delivery to the oceans during this body of the PETM. And they suggested that if some of this was oxidized, then it would have added enough CO2 to explain why the PETM went on for so long. But this study is just based on 2 regions. So firstly, you've got the Atlantic coastal plain, these sites 6 and 7 here, and then also this site in Tanzania. And so our main question was, do we see this anywhere else? Is this just a signal that's regional, or is this something that's global? And also, was it something that just occurred within this body of the PETM, or was it actually something that occurred throughout the PETM? And to answer these questions, this is where the data compilation comes in. So we were able to add 4 new sites, but also some new data to this Tanzania record here. Specifically, there was a gap at the start of the PETM, so we added some new data into that gap. And these are all shallow marine sites because they're the hotspots for material from land to be washed down and end up in. And so we look at these shallow marine sediments, and we identify if there's OC petro in them by using biomarkers. And biomarkers we can use as tracers for OC petro because they change their structure with higher temperature and higher pressure. And I'll use this as an example. So this is a hopanoid. This is a compound that's produced by bacteria for their membrane. And this is a kind of typical structure of a hopanoid. And at this 17 and 21 position, they have a beta-beta stereochemical configuration. And you don't need to know what that means, but the main thing is that bacteria make hopanoids with this particular structure. But with increasing thermal maturity, so higher temperature, higher pressure, you're shifting the 17 position from a beta to an alpha. So we can use this ratio of this mature altered structure of alpha beta versus this originally synthesized beta-beta configuration. And we actually don't just look at this ratio, we look at multiple other ratios. These are just some. And then we take each of these ratios and we identify the N members for what would be the most mature value. So in this case, a value of 1. And then also the immature N member. And then we multiply this with sedimentation rates and total organic carbon. And we calculate mass accumulation rate So therefore, we're able to quantify just how much OC Petro is going into these systems. And now on to the results. So these are just the 3 sites that have been pre-published, although this is actually including the additional data, this site 5. And I've plotted it to show the fold change from pre-PTM OC Petro mass accumulation rates to during the PTM. And since it's in the log scale, everything above 1 basically means there's an increase in OC Petro input during the PTM, and everything below 1 means there's a decrease. And so if I plot our new sites on there from this latitude, there's a really nice agreement. So they all increase, and they also all increase at a similar magnitude. So there seems to be at least enhanced OC Petro delivery in the mid-latitudes and subtropics, and we can confirm that previous paper that suggested this. However, if we look at the high latitude sites that we have, which is this northern hemisphere Arctic site and then the southern hemisphere site here, you can see the results are a little bit more varied. You've got an increase in the Arctic and a decrease at this ODP site 1172. However, when we look at the biomarkers, and I've just only plotted the alpha beta 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 ratio here because that's the one I explained, and you can see through depth there's actually no change. The record is very stable, and we don't just see this with this ratio, we see this with all the other ratios. So in the high latitudes, we don't seem to see a big change in the source of organic carbon. There doesn't seem to be an increase or a decrease in the input of OC Petro. Whereas with these mid-latitude sites in the subtropics, we do see a distinct shift during the PTM. And with the higher sedimentation rate during the PTM, we're then seeing this big increase in mass accumulation rates. So I guess our main next question following from these results was what was driving these changes, and why do we see this spatial variability? And so we firstly looked to the hydrological cycle because, as I mentioned, more rainfall has been linked with more material being moved. And this here is just mean annual precipitation plotted against the zonal gradient. The coloured lines represent model simulations based on varying CO2 levels. And then the black and grey symbols are proxy estimates. And if we plot the lower latitude sites, you could see based on the model simulations, they seem to fall at periods of time where there's low mean annual precipitation, so generally drier conditions. This is a little bit unexpected because, as I mentioned, more rainfall I thought would link with more OC Petro input, but instead we're seeing this drier condition. However, the proxies, these black and grey symbols, show evidence that there's more storm events and an increase in the frequency of these really intense rainfall events. And when actually you think about it, if you've got these very overall dry conditions, you're maybe stripping that landscape of vegetation. You've got a more barren landscape that could be prone to erosion, especially if there's a big storm event. You're going to be eroding a lot of material and moving a lot of material in these flood events that we see happening today as well. So this is probably why we're seeing this increase at this latitude, is because you've got this very extreme seasonality in the hydrological cycle. Whereas in the high latitudes, you've got overall wetter conditions, but less evidence of storm events. So this is probably why there's not a big shift in the biomarkers or much change that we see there. So I've talked about the spatial variability. And now just to go on to what was going on within the PTM and if there's temporal variability. This is the mass accumulation rates now plotted on the y-axis, and I've put the data in intervals of pre-PTM, and then I've split the PTM to the core, which includes the onset and the body, and then the recovery. We couldn't get this nice definition of each interval at all sites, but we did for these 3 sites. And you can see, interestingly, that in the recovery, the OC petromass accumulation rates remained quite high. At least it didn't go back to pre-PTM values. And actually in Ancora and South Dover Bridge, the median values for the recovery are higher than what we see in the core. So if this is the case, then that has some implications on considering what mechanisms might have drawn down CO2 to help with the recovery of the PTM, because whatever it is, it would have had to counteract the continuing input of CO2 if this OC petro is oxidized. And that point about if this OC petro is oxidized, the final point that I want to make, because I've talked mostly about, do we see an increase or a decrease in OC petro mobilization? But to then make the jump to, okay, we see an increase in the mid-latitudes, there must have been more CO2, is a jump we have to be quite cautious about. And I think this site here nicely is an example of why we need to be careful. Q River shows more OC petro input during the PTM. But when we look at the biomarkers, so again, I've just plotted the alpha beta ratio. You can see that during the PTM, there's actually a shift to less mature, lower values. So basically, we're seeing a dominance of the beta, the originally produced structure at this point. And that suggests that there's actually more OC bio going into the system. And if that is the case, then you're having a CO2 sink here, not a CO2 source. So this is just one example. There's other factors that's going to affect how much OC petro is being oxidized. But I think this highlights that we do need to consider what OC bio was doing as well. Because if it is like in this example, that OC bio is actually dominant, then we've got a very different story when it comes to if it was a CO2 source or sink. So just to kind of highlight my main take-home messages, I've popped the key questions back up on the top, and I hope I've been able to answer them clearly. So firstly, was it something that we see globally? Well, it seems definitely we see this signal in the mid-latitudes and the subtropics. In the high latitudes, it's at least not as distinct. We don't see any changes in the biomarker as we do in these lower latitudes. And the second question, was it persistent feature within the PTM? Well, it actually seems to be something that occurred post the body and throughout the recovery. So that's something that the previous study hadn't highlighted. And finally, it seems that extreme rainfall is really the key driver for the increase in OC petro mobilization. So I think especially with a future where we're expecting a more intense hydrological cycle of wet get wetter, dry get drier, and these extreme events, this is definitely a process which could become an important positive feedback mechanism in our future. And I was hoping to put up a link to the preprint for this study, but as we've only just submitted it, I haven't received it yet, but I've put my Twitter handle on there, and I'll hopefully post about that when the preprint does go live. So yeah, thank you very much for your time, and I'd be happy to hear any questions or thoughts about this.